Chapter 6, we're emphasizing even more discussion on politics of the 19th century. So we've been in the 19th century here again for a while. Now we're drilling down even a little deeper into politics. We see that even though there had been changes and advances, say from a democratic kind of process, we'll still see that for most of the 19th century, the majority of people, the mass of the population, was still disenfranchised when it came to representation or having the vote. And that's the subject this chapter spends the most time on. We'll see, I keep saying we'll see, sorry about that. We're seeing that there were progress in the male suffrage movements. You know, some of the property definition, or property qualifications, I should say, changed and were expanded a bit, and there was some movement that way. And we'll see that, later in the 19th century, even some electoral processes and things like that changed, for the better as well. But nevertheless, overall, there was still a lot of change to be done even after this century is over when it comes to universal suffrage for all, and especially for women and some of those movements. Going to the beginning of the century, we see a pretty oppressive state still, a suppressive state, where the reaction to people gathering, represented by the Peterloo Massacre of 1819. So, first of all, this was a peaceful gathering where units of cavalry just charged into the group, and after firing, weapons, etc., 15 people had lost their lives and more were injured. So if that wasn't bad enough, that kind of happened from a governmental standpoint, a policing standpoint, what probably is more grievous is following that is some enactments that were instituted, called the Six Acts of 1819. These are discussed page 192 and 195 in that range. And the thing that was really tough about these six acts, it actually really even justified what those, diving into the crowd that are with their horses and stuff. It kind of justified their actions. It further, put bans on how people could gather and people gathering, and gave authority, more authority for those to be broken up. In addition to that, we see that it further restricted freedom of press. So if you had any sedition ideas, this further restricted your ability to communicate those against the establishment. And then it even allowed officials to go into homes and sequester firearms. This is a pretty suppressive situation. We have a very heavy-handed nation state going on here, and that's how we open up, the 19th century, as it represents are related to representation, freedom of speech. So with any advances that have made prior to this that we have talked about, we still see at times, man, we've got a little ways to go here. Let's talk about even things like the Great Reform Act of 1832. I'm on page 196, and later in the chapter, page 206, talking about this Great Reform Act. The thing that I want you to recognize as you read this stuff, you should, is that, how legit were these reforms or not? We'll see that the motivations behind the powers that be, and giving concessions, if you will, was almost just to placate the reformers, almost like to take a little wind out of their sails, like throw them a bone, and so they just kind of all calm down. That's part of the motive, compared to really taking to heart, a true idea of representation. In addition to that, we'll see that some of those changes that were made kind of expanded some of the geography related to voting electorate, but it really didn't change composition, or it didn't really change the population by count where we'll see some groups and individuals really advocating for that. If you didn't really have a population change within a count of people to make up a jurisdiction, then what really have you done? You're just going to redrew some lines, but all the same people are involved. So we see that there seemed to have some changes, but like the author says on page 207, this act protected as much as it replaced of the Ancien regime. So it looked like some more democratic things were happening, but in reality, really not much happened at all. And so that's what's interesting about it being called great as well. Great Reforms Act, maybe not so great. Additionally, there was reform acts that followed in 1867, for example, and then 1884. 1884 is where we finally see even Ireland being included on equal terms as everybody else. And then we also see further expansion of property to now, if you're a lodger or a householder, or even those who are paying rent at certain values of rent, could be included now, not just if you are a property owner only. We see advances like that. Really key to this chapter, and the key to the voice of change in the middle of the 19th century was Chartism and the Chartist movement. And the book talks about by about 1840s or so, it had really peaked in its role, but it really helped set the stage for other reform movements to continue. But Chartism was important that it created a platform, and it was called the People's Charter, is what they called it. And it was asking for 6 things. It was asking for universal male suffrage. So in other words, it's not just qualifications developed by being ownership or some prestigious birthright positions, but that all males anyway should be allowed to vote, be poor or not. In addition to that, it called for annual elections. It called for a secret ballot. See, to us, we take that stuff for granted. We've been taking secret ballots for a long time, right? So imagine how new that this could have been. Where before, imagine go into a public situation, maybe it sounded a lot more like an auction, like a livestock auction or something like that, as people are just arguing and debating to try to get their voices heard, or maybe in the influence a handful of audience that actually would end up being representatives to you in a vote. Compared to now, not only are we wanting everybody to vote, at least the males, but then also that we can do it by secret ballot. It's a big new thought there. Constituencies of equal size. Again, not talking about geographical size. We're talking about the count of the population size. They also called for the abolition of property qualifications for members of parliament. So not just as a voter and changing those qualifications to be able to vote, but they even wanted to detach qualifications for being a member of parliament to property ownership. And then similar to that, connected to that, is then the abolition of payment of members of parliament. It's also interesting to note, and they showed both of these throughout this century, at least those several decades, where they had this opinion or this belief, this motto that said that it said peaceable if we can, forceful if we must. And we see a couple of events that represented both sides of that. We see the Newport uprising of 1839 that kind of relates to the forceful if we must, where that entire event was planned and instigated with scrapping and violent willingness at the get-go. But then we also see the huge meeting at the Kennington Commons, where a lot of advocacy again for male universal suffrage was happening. Lots of people met. But the reason I wanted to bring up that one, as it's discussed on page 200, is again we see the state's response even to that peaceful gathering. They arrested 15,000 people. that eventually they felt were connected to this movement. And then they also, within London itself, um, did the same with 150 of its most noted leaders and so forth. So again, we're seeing a very heavy-handed state when it comes to freedom of speech, freedom of getting together, things like that. The reaction to this. So unfortunate, but it's part of the story that we're looking at. We talk about in the questions, even talking a little bit about why would those in power have been leery of or unwilling to let others vote, unpropertied men, women, or any other exclusions that they would have had, initially Catholics or even non-Anglican Protestants. What were some of the motivations behind that? One of the discussion questions deals with that. One thing that's also important to mention here is the new electoral culture. What I'm getting at here is we had already been seeing expansion for changing, how elections were coming about, or the idea that instead of just having a couple voters who would hold meetings and get the public opinion and all those groups that are trying to influence a few people's votes because they supposedly were representing the sentiment of a region, compared to now, having everybody vote. And it's much more individual-like mindset. You're voting your own thoughts, your own opinions, versus, just trying to influence somebody else and do the vote for you. So there's a big change that's kind of going on. And with that in mind, then we see towards the later of the century, we see electoral registration starting to happen. Voting becomes more organized, a little more civil, and then of course the idea of a secret ballot as well. We even see in the middle of the century, in 1854, the Corrupt Practices Act. But take note, like the author mentioned, that this act made some gestures to try to limit, campaigning and who can get money and those kind of things. But it really was not policed real well. It was not like it was anybody really followed up to a certain standard to really implement those changes. But so it was maybe some gestures that were good in the sense that at least it started along the right path, but it didn't really holistically change a lot. I mentioned private voting. Look at my notes here real quick. And then, that's another thing I wanted to bring up again, the role of newspapers, pamphlets, and especially petitions. We see, according to the author, that he almost puts that at the top of the list of the thing that had the most impact on advocating for change, trying to get the sentiment of more people, maybe not the masses, but a whole lot more of them, but still strategic were the use of newspapers and pamphlets. As I've mentioned in other videos, I really appreciate how the author brings into perspective these other elements that were happening in society that fostered change, or maybe at times didn't. But here again, newspapers, pamphlets, petitions were being used and utilized in new ways. So some things were new, let alone the way they were using them were new. On your discussion questions, we go into about, did the politics become more representative or less representative throughout the 19th century? So I brought up some of the things I told you about, so you guys could catch that. Again, I felt like the key things he mentioned is that there was almost a genius that he mentions that were behind crafting these enactments, like crafting them to strategically keep everything about the same, yet appear to be more democratic. And that was happening quite a bit, even though we did have some change, good change. We talked a question completely devoted to reasons for excluding women and unproperty men from voting, where that would have come from, why would they be doing that, where are those perspectives coming from, why were they so pervasive in that culture. Lastly, the third question, how and why did some white settlers embrace adult male suffrage before Britain. Really, really cool study here, as we've been focused on Great Britain as an epicenter of the discussion. Then all of a sudden we're backing out over here and recognizing that in other areas of its empire, its colonies, you can almost have some different stories, with how fast suffrage expanded, especially universally to males in different colonies, or like Australia especially. And then we ask why. Why was that different? What were some of the motivations? What are the things in place on why that would have happened differently than at home? Looking forward to seeing what you all say about that as well, and interacting with you on the discussions.